It's Friday, May 22nd. I'm Brian Walsh, and welcome to This Week in Impact, where I talk with ImpactAlpha journalists and editors about some of the most interesting impact investing stories we've been covering. This week, I'm joined by our Nairobi based journalist, Lucy Ngige, and our Brooklyn based editor, Amy Cortese. We'll discuss the launch of the ImpactAlpha Africa newsletter and the new ways capital is being mobilized for impact on the continent. Plus, we'll spotlight two African funds investing in human capital and creating high productivity jobs. And finally, we'll discuss how some LPs are stepping up to help emerging managers cross the chasm to their next fund. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. To start us off, I'm joined by Lucy Ngige, our Nairobi-based correspondent. Welcome back to the podcast, Lucy.
Hi, Brian. I'm so happy to be back.
Now, Lucy, this week we launched the ImpactAlpha Africa newsletter, which you had a big hand in putting together. In your opinion, why is now the time for the impact investing community to be focused on investment opportunities in Africa?
So, first of all, the newsletter is really exciting for us. It's sort of a culmination of the work that we've been doing across Africa. And, it goes to show the relationships that we've been able to build along the way. To your question, I'll say, Africa has what we call the demographic opportunity. We're the youngest continent, and we also have the fastest growing population. Right now, that sits at around 1.6 billion. But by 2050, it is projected that around 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. So these figures show that, one, we will have one of the largest workforces in the world, but also that represents a massive consumer base. So that's enough reason, to focus on Africa.
Absolutely. And this growing workforce and this growing consumer base is a huge market opportunity. And you've been focusing on the different ways that capital is being mobilized to invest in this market opportunity. Tell us about the new innovations and the new approaches that are being taken.
Capital mobilization for small and growing businesses has been one of the beats that I've been covering a lot lately. I have to say it is one of my most exciting beats because around 90% of the businesses in Africa are small and growing businesses. But for the longest time, they have been overlooked by financiers, both commercial lenders and DFIs, just because of their size. Their size is not a match to what these financiers typically deploy. So, an interesting trend that I've seen is Africa's institutional investors step up to fill the gap that was left with the exit of financing from organizations like USAID and the rollback of development financing capital from some providers. So it's been so exciting to see our domestic institutional capital providers step up. And they're very much willing to design funds and work with local fund managers to design structures that can efficiently channel capital to our small and growing businesses.
Right. So, with the pullback in both foreign aid and also foreign development capital and investments from DFIs and the like, these local capital providers, so sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and diaspora bonds and the like, are kind of stepping up and figuring out how to build out the homegrown impact investing ecosystems that are needed for the growth here to be durable.
Exactly. And we have to remember that our institutional capital providers on the continent sit on around 2 trillion in assets. So it's not like the capital for development or the capital that can support these small businesses is not there. It's just that for the longest time, there haven't been efficient structures to channel that capital to them. And for the most part, organizations like pension funds have often opted to invest in government bonds or treasury bills. But because development for the continent is urgent, And now more than ever, the writing on the wall is we have to use our own resources to develop our own continent. I feel like it's the right time, and it's quite exciting to see the responsiveness of these pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance companies.
So, can you walk me through some examples of who's stepping up in what areas?
Sure. So a few weeks ago, I was in Uganda at a convening that was hosted by the National Social Security Fund of Uganda. That is one of the public pension funds. And NSSF is very clear on what they want to do. They are allocating 1% of their assets under management, which is around 6 or 7 billion. They are allocating 1% of that to social impact, to fulfilling social impact. And then from that pool, they are taking 15 million to commit to a 100 million fund of funds that they are designing. So the convening was to bring in other pension funds, to bring in fund managers, and other players within the impact investing ecosystem to help them design or see which vehicles would be most efficient to support small businesses in their country. So they settled on a fund of funds, and that is the 100 million fund of funds. And apart from the 15 million that they're putting into Anchor, they are looking at mobilizing the rest of the capital from regional pension funds.
So that's an interesting example of a local institution stepping up to design an appropriate capital structure for the local system. Can you also tell us about some of the local actors that are trying to build out the enabling environment, the broader impact investing ecosystem across Africa?
There are a couple of ecosystem conveners or ecosystem builders that are doing some really great work. One of them is GSG Impact, and we've been engaging with them because they're trying to set up what they call national advisory boards in three new jurisdictions on the continent. So they're very present in countries like Ghana and Zambia, but they want to scale and expand these advisory boards, which they call NABs, into Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Burkina Faso. So the reason GSG Impact wants to scale these NABs is they want to bring different actors in the ecosystem to one table to see how they can create the conditions necessary for impact economies to thrive. And so these actors are like government, fund managers, and the entrepreneurs themselves, and a lot more other ecosystem enablers.
So every market requires a localized design. There's no one size fits all structure.
Exactly. So what I like is they've been able to do a lot of research with backing from the Japanese government, but they've done substantial research to see which vehicles or which instruments are best suited or best fitted to raise capital for impact within these economies. So in countries like Ghana, they've been able to raise domestic capital for the Chigaba Fund of Funds, and a lot of the investors actually in Chigaba are Ghanaian pension funds, so local pension funds. So GSG, with its different task forces in these other countries, is trying to see whether they can replicate this fund of funds. I've seen Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire are considering taking that route. But in other countries like Burkina Faso, where the pension funds are not as active in that market, they are considering launching impact bonds and then using the proceeds to channel that capital for SME finance.
Super interesting. So allowing each market kind of develop the structures and instruments that make sense in their local context. All right, you can read Lucy's piece on how local actors are working to build durable, homegrown impact investing ecosystems as part of our debut Impact Alpha Africa newsletter. It's on impactalpha.com, and there's also a link in our show notes. Later in the show, editor Amy Cortese will join me to discuss how some LPs are stepping up to help emerging managers cross the chasm to their next fund. But for now, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, Lucy and I will talk about her recent spotlight on African funds investing in human capital and new jobs.
Hi there, Agent of Impact. This is Dennis Price, CEO of Impact Alpha. For more than a decade, Impact Alpha has been helping you find the alpha in impact. We've now built Impact Alpha Edge to bring you structured data and market intelligence to help you move faster, invest smarter, and multiply your impact. Impact Alpha Edge is designed to help GPs and fund managers raise capital more effectively. LPs and allocators find each other and discover overlooked opportunities. Think of it as a purpose-built pitch book for impact, with the editorial judgment and network trust that no algorithm can replicate. Come check it out. Book a demo today. Learn more about Impact Alpha Edge in our show notes.
Next up, Lucy, you wrote a spotlight on how 2 African funds are investing in human capital and creating high productivity jobs. Let's start with the first one, the Future of Work Fund. Who's behind this effort and what are they trying to accomplish?
So Future of Work is a fund by Chanson International. And Chanson is a nonprofit that operates within the East Africa region. They're based in Rwanda, but they operate across Rwanda and Kenya and I think one country in West Africa. And they set up the Future of Work Fund primarily because they offer income share agreements. So, zero collateral loans for students to be able to access tertiary education or be placed in universities in the region. And the reason we were spotlighting them is, they just secured 29 million as the first close of this fund. They're looking at reaching a final close of 33 million by the end of the year. And some of the people that have supported them are people, we cover a lot in our coverage, UBS Optimus Foundation, Kenyath, the Sao Family Office as well.
Yeah, as you highlighted in our first segment, Lucy, the youth dividend on the continent is going to be enormous with a fast-growing youth population. So this Future of Work Fund is an alternative finance mechanism to kind of help finance that human capital development. So talk us through some of the mechanics of an income share agreement and how it works in practice.
So the way Chanson structures the agreements is they offer zero collateral loans for young people who are predominantly based in rural and low income communities. So they aim to give these loans to people who would perhaps not be able to access loans for education or who would have difficulty in repaying these loans. So Chanson requires no upfront payments or no collateral or guarantors. And they claim that this model has been doing quite well. And they have registered like a 97% repayment rate for their loans.
Wow, that's impressive. Let's switch gears to the second African fund that you spotlighted that's focused on creating high productivity jobs. So tell us about the Africa Jobs Fund. Who's behind it and what are they trying to accomplish?
So the African Jobs Fund is a 100 million jobs fund that's launching this week, actually. I had a sit down with its founder. His name is Daniel Yu, a well-known founder within the Africa startup ecosystem because he started Wasoko, which is a B2B retail startup that merged with an e-commerce giant in Egypt. So after running it for over a decade, Daniel stepped down from his role as CEO to launch the Africa Jobs Fund. And I think what's exciting is they're really focused on creating quality and decent jobs for African youth. So the job will primarily focus on investing in companies that are involved in manufacturing and export-oriented manufacturing companies at that, because they have, significant job creation potential. And so ultimately, the fund's goal is to improve people's livelihoods and ensure that the millions of Africans that leave university and want to enter the workforce are able to secure placement.
And so, what are the typical barriers for people to be placed in these types of jobs?
So I think this goes back to our conversation earlier on how rapidly the continent is growing. And we're at a point where our tertiary institutions or our universities are churning out more educated people than the workforce can absorb. So the Africa Jobs Fund is one of the interventions, to be able to create enough jobs for the youth, and create opportunities where local governments are not able to do so.
So it's filling a gap in the market that no one else is currently equipped to step into.
I will say a couple of the people that we engage with within this ecosystem do try to create jobs for youth or create vehicles that ultimately lead to job creation. And even when we go back to the conversation on pension funds, why are they investing in SMEs? Because SMEs create the largest number of jobs on the continent. And our pension funds are at that point where it's in their best interest to create new generations of savers, because they're now paying out more in premiums than they are getting in. So a lot of these conversations are actually interconnected. And I think this is why we're starting to see a lot more investment for SMEs, but we're also starting to see a lot more programs and funds as well that are sort of geared towards job creation.
All right, that's super interesting. Well, you can read Lucy's spotlight on the Future of Work Fund and the Africa Jobs Fund on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. And congratulations on the launch of ImpactAlpha Africa newsletter.
Thanks for having me again.
All right, we'll have you back soon. But for now, we're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, Amy Cortese joins me to discuss how some limited partners and funds are helping emerging fund managers cross the chasm from their first to second funds. Finally, this week, I'm joined by editor Amy Cortese. Welcome back to the podcast, Amy.
Thanks, Brian. Glad to be here.
And happy early Memorial Day to you. Hope you're going to take advantage of the long weekend.
Well, it's rainy here, but I plan to.
All right, Amy. Now, this week you wrote for us about the challenges facing emerging and diverse fund managers, many of whom are now hitting a wall trying to raise their second and third funds. Set the scene for us. How do we get from this moment of historic commitment to diverse fund managers in 2020 to what sounds like a pretty significant retreat just 5 or 6 years later?
Yeah, Brian, if you think back to 2020, right, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis prompted a real racial reckoning, and there was an outpouring of support as, people belatedly maybe attempted to right historic wrongs and help mend a very big racial wealth gap. One way they did that was by committing to back Black and diverse led fund managers as a way to help close that racial wealth gap. So we saw a lot of big corporations, from Target and PayPal to Microsoft and some of the big banks and institutional investors, all stepping up and making commitments to Black and diverse fund managers, which of course resulted in a whole new crop of fund managers. Minority and women-owned firms made up 63% of first-time funds in 2020 and 2021, according to Fairview Capital.
Now, you reported that Fairview Capital also noted that now in 2025, diverse fund managers actively raising capital fell by 12%. And that's the first decline that they've ever recorded. So put us in context. Not all of this decline is due to the political backlash to DEI. Let's talk about some of the compounding factors affecting emerging and diverse fund managers.
Yeah, exactly, Brian. 2020, 2021, these are tough vintages overall, right? If you think back, interest rates were very low. There was a flood of capital into the private markets and a lot of competition for deals. So a lot of fund managers lowered their standards a little bit and loosened some of their typical discipline to compete for deals. And so that's why today you see across the board a lot of VCs and private equity firms marking down their portfolio valuations because everything got a little heated. But as we know, emerging managers face extra obstacles in the form of bias and just being held to a higher standard where they really have to prove their track records. And I just want to say, to be sure, like not all diverse emerging managers are struggling. Some are thriving and outperforming, but in this environment, there are a lot of newer managers that really are hitting that wall that we talked about.
So how are some LPs trying to step into the breach here to support some of the emerging and diverse fund managers that they had backed back in 2020?
Yeah, even as some of the more transient investors, the corporations and brands that kind of jumped into the pool, even as they retreat, you have a lot of LPs that are stepping up and even doubling down. So we talked to Javier Hernandez, for example, at California Wellness Foundation, which is a billion-dollar private foundation that is seeded first and second funds for emerging managers. And it's really sticking to its commitment there. And the interesting thing is the foundation sees this as part of its mission, right? Because it sees wealth and power as key determinants of social health. So some of the ways it's doing that, when it first started exploring investing in GPs and emerging managers, it did so via its philanthropic bucket, but now it has moved a lot of those original PRIs over to its endowment to signal, a measure of seriousness to other investors. And it's also committing to second and even third funds. It's backed emerging managers like Vamos Ventures, Urban Innovation Fund, and Illumin Capital, to name a few. I also spoke to Living Cities, which is an allocator more than an LP, but they're one of a handful of firms that are providing working capital to emerging fund managers so they can get on their feet, before they actually have revenues coming in the door.
Right. As you noted, it costs at least $300,000 just to launch a new fund and all the different expenses you need to do, legal and accounting and the like.
Exactly. And a lot of these are smaller funds and their fees are not kicking in until later. And, again, as we know, like the exit market has been not very open for a while. So they're not, they don't have the liquidity there either.
All right. Well, you can read Amy's piece on how some LPs are helping emerging fund managers on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in the show notes. But that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you for joining me today, Amy.
Thanks, Brian. I enjoyed it as well.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For Lucy Ngige and Amy Cortese, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more Impact.